The UK has Online Safety Act, EU has DSA. There's a couple of things that are contributing to this conversation. Where is US law? I think similar to the privacy and the AI context, we're curious as well. So this is, I'll just kind of give you the context of US legislation right now. It's one of the least productive congressional sessions in US history. The 118th Congress, so they're numbered per term, passed 34 bills in 2023, which is the least since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And for comparison, Congress passed 362 bills the year before, and 3 years ago, 442. So we're at about a tenth of productivity right now. There's several reasons for that. Obviously, you're familiar with breakdowns in the political landscape, but the practical impact is that, legislation, even with bipartisan support, which I think aside from some particular details, online safety, privacy type legislation generally is, it still stands almost no chance of passage right now. So there's nothing that's going to be equivalent to even that kind of level right now. But there is, similar to the UK, there's some draft legislation that has been proposed to address deepfakes. One of the House Representatives, Representative Clark from New York, introduced the Deepfakes Accountability Act recently, which it was intended initially to sort of counter national security threats that were posed by deepfakes, but also to provide legal recourse to individuals. There was a proposed penalty of fines and prison time for disclosing deepfakes with the intent to humiliate or harass a person falsely exhibited in sexual content. There was a private right of action proposed for victims of this behavior in federal court. Damages to include the greater of actual damages and derivative profits up to $150,000 per record. And it would have been implemented by the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's offices. So this is an example, I think a pretty illustrative example of what we've seen introduced. There's a series of other federal drafts: Preventing Deepfakes of Intimate Images Act, an AI Labeling Act of 2023, and then another Defiance Act in 2024. But these have significantly, I think a lot of these bills have had pretty well-known bipartisan support from senators and representatives that in the U.S. are household names. Dick Durbin from Illinois, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, and Josh Hawley from Missouri. So these are pretty broad political spectrum representatives that have showed interest in this topic and seems to be able to coalesce around it, but still not happening right now. So we've seen a pretty big uptick in draft legislation related specifically to children's online safety as well, but that's not extended further into the protection of women online. Obviously happy to speak about that, but it's not relevant to the panel. So that aside, the sort of federal legislation being very bleak, we have the state legislation side of it. So many of you will have noticed that in the U.S., states are typically the first to act on a lot of these issues. It's obviously a bit easier because they're not balancing 50 states worth of ideologies and constituent equities and interests. But in this case, a couple of states, Indiana, New York, and Virginia, have enacted laws that add deepfakes to existing prohibitions on non-consensual sharing of intimate images. Georgia and Hawaii have updated their privacy laws to incorporate some provisions related to deepfakes. And a couple of other states, Florida, South Dakota, and Washington, have tackled deepfakes with respect to minors, but not to adults. There's been some bills introduced in Missouri, New Jersey, and Ohio. And I think, interestingly, in kind of the direction I see this headed, in Illinois, lawmakers took an approach to addressing deepfakes through the context of AI. And I think that's typically what we're going to see is, AI is, I think, a broader topic and somewhere that it might be easy to include references to deepfakes and try to add a little bit more to this legal landscape. So in AI, generally, I think an important angle to consider here, right, is that deepfakes typically do fall into the larger bucket of AI. There's not, as you know, U.S. unified legislation on AI either, but the administration has been working to push out responsible AI guidance following on from some of the things released recently, the National Institute for Standards and Technology's AI Risk Management Framework and its newer generative AI profile, and then the White House's previous blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So the administration, I think, right now is trying to push a little bit more policy along those lines to do what it can, asking for voluntary commitments from companies to implement risk management best practices, Obviously, this is a little bit of a tricky landscape because it's not, a lot of times it's just done maliciously. So it's hard to protect against all the time. But the idea is that although the executive branch can only impose requirements sort of on ourselves, the resources that we can release and that promote our collective knowledge and best practices might help companies that have an opportunity to promote safety and maybe move the needle of the conversation a little bit. I'm sure that many of us by now are familiar with the AI risk management framework and other administration guidance, but if not, NIST has it's NIST. It has an AI resource center website that you can find with a pretty quick search to kind of give you a sense of what on the federal side we're trying to push out around AI. So there's another context in U.S. law, sort of as a backup option to the AI and online harms. We still have some criminal prosecutorial avenues available if there is sort of a case of malintent. So federal and state legislatures both have existing criminal statutes that address cases of harassment and stalking, which underlie a lot of these cases, as Claudia was describing. So it's a federal crime for anyone to cross state lines with the intent to harass or intimidate another person or place them in fear of death or bodily injury, with the intent to cause emotional distress. So that's obviously was not originally written for deepfakes, right? But the DOJ Criminal and National Security Divisions have used this statute to try to prosecute some instances of interstate domestic violence in context of spousal or intimate partner abuse, and have occasionally been able to extend that to online violence where injury does result. But this and other criminal law is very limited by the context of the statute and the relevant fact pattern, and it really all kind of has to align for a prosecution to be successful here. So at both the federal and state level, offenses that are not expressly captured in law must be more strategically prosecuted under these sort of related statutes or state laws, for instance, that address cyberbullying or obscenity or harassment. So not looking great in the legal landscape, but in related policy efforts, there's, talk a little bit more about that, try to give a little optimism. So there's a White House task force to address online harassment and abuse. That's intended to respond to the Summit for Democracy, to pushes by the UN Women, and the general need for government leadership to address online harms. And that would be harms that disproportionately affect women and girls, people of color, and LGBTQ individuals. Bilateral partnerships moving right now, like the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. And then there's a U.S.-UK Comprehensive Dialogue on Technology and Data. And then the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council have all been used as avenues to try to tackle these topics. So at the sixth ministerial of the TTC earlier this year, the U.S. and EU released a set of joint principles on combating gender-based violence in the digital environment. Those were broken into three sort of larger buckets. One is the empowerment of women and girls. So that includes inclusive access to digital technologies and skills training, promoting the participation of women and girls in the conceptualization and development of digital technologies, AI, and related policies, and then essentially mainstreaming the inclusion of women's perspectives in technological innovation, which is, to some degree helpful in this respect. Protection from technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So this would include encouraging online platforms to identify and mitigate systemic risks embedded in their services, comply with applicable domestic laws and regulations, obviously, place effective and proportionate measures to identify and mitigate the risks to women and girls, with a particular focus on those that are in public-facing or vulnerable roles who are more likely to be targeted, and reminding governments of their obligations under international law. And then the final bucket is facilitation of data access from online platforms for independent research on this topic. So that's encouraging platforms to provide researchers with access to accurate representative data sets, and guidance for researchers tackling these issues to encourage the use of best practices to mitigate underrepresentation in the evidence base for gender-based violence studies. And so one final effort I'll talk about is the State Department's new Safe Online program, which addresses risks of online violence against women in business by encouraging governments and private companies to implement online gender-based violence and sexual harassment policies. I think most of us would agree that it's shocking we still need to say that, but we do.